All right, so in the first lecture, we talked about the development of absolutism, and we talked about a particular, the reign of one particular monarch, King Louis XIV, and how he kind of set up his absolute monarchy. And so you may want to go back and rewatch that if you haven't, or you don't remember much from that. Go back and rewatch that and make sure that you're clear on what absolutism is. Now we're going to move on to the second political theory that kind of emerged in the 17th century, which is constitutionalism. And again, there is more than one place where we see the development of constitutionalism, but we're really going to just focus down on one, and that's in England. So yeah, we see it in the Netherlands, we see it in a couple different places, but really England is where we're going to focus on, specifically the reign of King Charles I. All right? So as we dive into the political theory of constitutionalism, again, make sure that you're aware of, what absolutism was, because these are kind of opposite ideas. And hopefully you kind of remember that absolutism is a political theory where the ruler is the source of all political authority, complete authority. You also might remember that a lot of it was based on the idea of the divine right of kings, and that the king of a country would get their political and governmental authority directly from God. And so they don't have to answer to anyone but God. And of course, this theory of absolutism essentially means the king's above the law. And so this is contrasted by constitutionalism. In constitutionalism, it's the idea of a limited monarchy, the idea that the king is actually under the law. And if the king is under the law, that means that something is above him, because the law is not an actual authoritative thing by itself. What makes the law or the Constitution an actual source of power is the people. Because in a constitutionalist government style, like the United States of today, in theory, the idea is that you have the consent of the governed, and that the governed people are responsible for putting together a constitution, and then that constitution, in agreement with the king or with the ruler of that country, kind of work under this system. And so really people in constitution can be kind of used interchangeably in terms of who's really in control of a constitutionalist government. But we're going to use the Constitution as the word that we say because it kind of fits with, constitutionalism. And so if we look at what happens in England, we see it beginning to be expressed with this idea of not just the king being the one in charge, but also with the help of what is Parliament. And, Parliament is kind of like what we think of as like Congress. And so while England doesn't have a written constitution, what they're basically saying here is that the king has to rule alongside Parliament, and that each group, king and Parliament, has particular rights and particular responsibilities in order to make that political system work. And the English say that the king should remain in balance with Parliament. And that starts to really unravel during the reign of King Charles I. A lot of people are going to blame King Charles I for causing what becomes known as the English Civil War. And there's some merit to that argument. You could definitely say he was the, main factor, his obstinance against Parliament. But in his defense, to some extent, and you do need to understand that some of the things he did were, for a reason. When he takes the throne, he's really facing some major religious and economic challenges. When it comes to religion, the main thing that he has to figure out is how he's going to maintain the peace between a small group of English Catholics that still live in England, the much, much larger group of Anglican Protestants, and then there's actually going to be a third group called the Puritans. And so, but really what he's dealing with is this Anglican Catholic divide. Now remember, Queen Elizabeth, when she was in power, really sets up the Anglican Church in a very kind of interesting way. She says, we're going to take the Protestant theology, but to kind of keep some people happy, we're going to really kind of implement some of these Catholic Church practices and ceremonies. And so if you think of it kind of like a Milky Way bar, right? That you have the nice Protestant nougat on the inside, covered by a nice chocolate Catholic covering. nice thin layer of chocolate Catholic covering with the Protestant nougat filling, okay? Primarily Protestant, little bit of Catholic on the outside, makes it sweet for everyone, okay? And so that's really how she kind of sets it up. And it was really a smart way of doing this because she really kind of appeased both groups. And it really kept from having a major religious war like we saw in some of the other countries in Europe. However, then you end up with the Puritans. And the Puritans are Protestants who think the Church of England and Elizabeth herself didn't actually go far enough with the English church. They thought that she still kept it a little too Catholic. They just wanted a hunk of nougat. They didn't want any Catholic chocolate covering. They just wanted that sweet, creamy Protestant filling, okay? And so they instead believed that they should replace even more ideas with like John Calvin's ideas. They wanted to get rid of the system of bishops. They believed in, simplistic religious practice, not having to go up to the priest, not having these elaborate ceremonies. They thought that a board of elders and ministers should be in charge of local churches instead of a hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which was still kind of in existence with Anglicanism. And so when King Charles takes over, after Elizabeth, you had James I, and James I kind of maintains what Elizabeth was doing. Charles I comes to power, and he has an issue because he is going to marry a French princess named Henrietta Marie. Now, with her being French, she is going to be Catholic because the French are Catholic. And part of this marriage agreement that he makes with the French is that she's going to be allowed to have a priest in the palace and have mass in the palace. Well, obviously, this is going to make a lot of the Puritans, especially the Puritans, think, well, she's going to try and convert him to Catholicism, and we're going to all end up in a civil war again. So this is really going to make them upset. And so that's some of the religious challenges that he's going to have to face with. He's also going to come face to face with economic challenges, particularly that the royal treasury is running out of money. When he comes to the throne, England is faced with some economic challenges. Queen Elizabeth had spent fairly heavily. Charles, his dad, James I, had also spent very heavily. And when he takes over, he realizes he's going to have to increase taxes in order to bring more money into the royal treasury. And as we've noted, in England, there is a very common practice that dates back to, the High Middle Ages, that if the king is going to increase taxes, he is going to have to call a meeting of Parliament and get their permission. That was part of the Magna Carta, right? And so it is this economic challenge that is going to bring some of the very first tensions between King Charles and Parliament. So again, one of the rights that English kings have is the right to call Parliament and dismiss Parliament. And he can call them and dismiss them anytime he wants. And so in the first 3 years of his reign, he does this several times. He would call Parliament, try and get them to go along with, raising taxes. They would disagree with him, so he would dismiss them, say, y'all go home. And then he'd call another Parliament. Well, he calls three different parliaments in 3 years. And so when we get to the year 1629, King Charles decides, after he dismisses yet another parliament that he hasn't gotten along with, he simply just isn't going to call Parliament together at all. And so for the next 11 years, King Charles is going to rule without consulting Parliament whatsoever. And historians have really termed this time period during his reign the period of personal rule. Okay? And now I want you to think about the lesson of absolutism. And how does this connect? Well, if you think about Louis XIV, he also decided he was no longer going to consult with the governing body of the normal people of France, called the Estates General. He decides, I'm not going to call you anymore because you won't give me what I want. Now Charles is doing the same thing. And this is going to make people think, is Charles trying to become an absolutist? And so during this time of personal rule, he's still dealing with these economic and religious difficulties, and he's going to try and do them and deal with them without Parliament's help. When it comes to the economic challenges, he needs to raise money. He starts to come up with a new way to do it. Now, he's not allowed to impose a new tax. So he starts to look for a way to use the existing taxes that are in place. How can I use the existing taxes to accomplish what I need by raising them? Well, there was one called the ship tax. And basically the ship tax was that in coastal towns around England, because it's an island, if you lived in a coastal town, you had a special tax that you had to pay every year to raise money for the Navy. So the Navy, to protect the coastline so that somebody couldn't just sail up and raid you there on a coastal town. So it was called the ship money tax. Well, he decides, I'm going to expand that. I can't start a new tax, but I can expand an existing one. So he starts raising money for the ship tax to protect the border from every town in England, even ones that aren't on the border. Well, people are like, you can't do that. This is a new tax. This is illegal. He says, oh, no, it's not illegal. This is already in place. I'm just saying everybody has to pay it now, right? Everybody needs to protect England, not just the coastal cities. Well, people are not going to like that, and they refuse to pay it. Well, when they refuse to pay it, King Charles responds by throwing people in prison, especially nobles, and then he seizes their estates and takes all their money. And so they're protesting this stuff, and they don't like it. They also don't like his efforts within the church. One of the major ones that comes up is the major church official at the time is a man named William Laud. He is the Archbishop of Canterbury. People start to complain about some of the decisions that the Archbishop is making. Of course, he's being backed by the king. And so these three individuals start to write pamphlets in protest against the church and against this Archbishop William Laud. These three men are actually in this drawing. You can see them here in the stocks. Their names are Henry Burton, John Bastwick, and William Prynne. So Burton, Bastwick, and Prynne, they start writing these things about English bishops. And so they get called into court, and they're told, hey, stop writing nasty things about the English bishop. And they're like, no, we're not going to stop doing that. Maybe he just needs to stop being so bad. Well, that didn't go over well, and so they throw him in prison. Well, while they're in prison, they continue to write things, have it smuggled out of the country. They send it to Amsterdam, where their writings are printed and then brought back to England, smuggled back in and distributed. So when they go to prison, they actually really step up their game. The king gets really mad about their writings. So he brings them before his special court called the Star Chamber Court. It's his private court of justice. And he says all three of these men are found guilty of seditious libel. So as punishment, they're taken out to the pillory or the stocks, and they cut their ears off. And then put them in perpetual imprisonment in very remote parts of England. Now, the way that these three men are treated, because of their critique of the king and his church, caused shockwaves throughout England. Because, cutting people's hands or ears or noses off, it wasn't unusual necessarily, but it was for men of this stature. I mean, this is a doctor, a lawyer, one of them's a minister. They're upper class people, and they're being treated like very low class citizens. And all they're really doing is, protesting the ship money tax, censorship, and so they're basically saying King Charles is starting a absolute monarchy, and he just doesn't like that. For the first 11 years, this time period of personal rule, we see this discontent kind of simmering. All it really needs is a spark to really light everything on fire, and that spark comes from Scotland with the Bishop Wars. So what's happening here is the bishop, what's known as the Bishop Wars, begins when Archbishop William Laud takes the Anglican Book of Prayer, which, so in English Anglican worship, they don't just use the Bible, they kind of have these recitals and these prayers that they say throughout, kind of like the Catholics where you have the response, the choral response where, the response is this, right? And so it's this book of prayers that are very common prayers that they say together and recite together in these book of responses. And they've been using this for a long time. Well, William Laud takes that book of prayers and revises it to more suit King Charles, what he's trying to do. It's more, he changes some of them to be more supportive of King Charles. Well, they send this book out to all the churches in England and in Scotland because King Charles is also the King of Scotland. The Archbishop sends it out, and the English priests that are there start using this new prayer book. And you can see from this woodcut drawing, it's from a pamphlet that was kind of like giving out the news of what's going on at the time, kind of like the foxnews.com or CNN.com of the time. People like print this story about what happens when this bishop, this priest, starts reading from the new prayer book. So imagine being in Mass and everybody is sitting there in the pews, but maybe there wasn't enough pews for everybody. So back then there weren't enough pews, so you brought your own stool and your own chair. So imagine everybody brings their own folding chairs, kind of like how when we do it out on the football field and we have Mass and everybody's got their own chairs. And imagine the priest getting up and beginning their homily, and it is so upsetting to everybody that they stand up, fold up their chairs, and start throwing them at the priest. Like throwing their chairs, start throwing their hymn books, start throwing their books of prayer all at the priest because they're like, this is heresy, this is garbage. You're just shilling for the king. This is not religion, right? And that's basically what starts happening. And the Scots decide to get together and say, we're going to revolt against England. We're going to go and we're going to raise an army. We're going to march against England, and we're going to abolish this episcopacy that is in charge of the church right now. And we're going to put a more Calvinist model in charge, where the ministers and elders have control of the church. And we're going to get rid of Anglicanism and bring Calvinism. And so when the King Charles hears this, he says, oh, the people of Scotland are in revolt. I need to raise an army. Well, to raise an army, what do you need? Money. And he's already run out of money. So he needs to raise taxes. The only way to raise taxes, according to the Magna Carta, is you have to call Parliament. Well, he hasn't done that in 11 years. So he decides, I'm going to call a session of Parliament. And it's the first time in 11 years, and they sit down and he says, hey, we need to go fight the Scots. They're going to march against England. And the Parliament says, yeah, sure. We'll give you an army. We'll give you some money. But you're going to have to sit down and listen to our complaints. Now, it's been 11 years since they've got to complain. It's a long list. Basically, they said, you're going to have to sit on your throne, and we're going to bash you in front of your face, and you're not going to be able to say anything, and then we'll let you have your money, and you're going to meet some of our demands. And he's like, no, I'm not doing that. Y'all get out of here. He dismisses them, like, immediately. It's so fast that it's like it becomes known as the short parliament. Here's the problem, though. He kicks them out, and he's like, I'm not listening to that crap. And they're like, but, sir, we still need an army. He's like, oh, yeah. Bring them back. And then he brings them back, and then, again, they say, hey, you got to listen to our demands, and then we'll give you an army. This becomes known as the Long Parliament, because they had a lot to say. Okay? For the Long Parliament demands, this is what they say. They're willing to give the king money, but they want him to agree to call a session of Parliament at least every 3 years. Okay, so a regular meeting of Parliament. Also, he's not allowed to end the session of Parliament without their consent first. So you have to call us every 3 years, and we're going to stay in session until we feel like we're done, and then we'll leave. Also, you're not allowed to collect taxes without Parliament's consent, and you have to abolish the Star Court, the private court of justice. Now think, what is the purpose of all four of these? What are they trying to prevent from happening? They're trying to prevent absolutism. That's correct. They don't want him to be an absolutist. And these four things, in their mind, prevent him from being able to be an absolutist. So, what can he do? He has to agree, because if he doesn't, the Scottish are going to march against England, and there's nothing he can do about it. So he agrees, but he's still very, very upset about it. So they say, here's your army, go fight the Scots. Tensions are still going to run high, though. Then you get the Irish revolt the next year. The Irish, if you know anything about the Irish, during the time of Queen Elizabeth and James I, the English invade Ireland, and they bring Ireland into the United Kingdom. And they start to implement English policies there. Now, the English and the Scots are Protestant. The Irish are primarily Catholic. And so when the Scots revolt and the Irish see the English raising an army, they're afraid that after they finish with the Scots, they're going to come and try and implement Protestantism in Ireland as well. And so the Irish decide we're going to instead preemptively lead a strike against the English. And so they start to rebel also. And so Charles goes to Parliament again. He says, hey, there's another revolt. I know I've already got the Scottish army, but I need another army. And the Parliament says, okay, that's fine, but this time we'll give you an army as long as we are in control of the army. You don't get to be in control of the army. Well, that's not going to sit well with Charles because that's what kings do. They lead armies, right? And so he's like, I'm not doing it. Well, then the propaganda starts. And so you get a lot of propaganda coming out of Ireland that the Irish are doing these terrible things to the Protestants there, like that they're rounding them up and torturing them to death, and that they're taking pregnant women and cutting their babies out and throwing them into the fires, and that they're doing all these terrible things. And they're whipping up all this frenzy about how awful this Irish revolt is. And this puts even more pressure on Charles to go and do something about it. But he does not want to deal with Parliament. He doesn't want to agree to their terms. And so he eventually says, I'm just going to do what I want. And so Parliament demands control, and he decides, no, I'm not going to do it, because they think if you have this second army, you're going to come use it against us. And so what he decides is, I'm not dealing with this. There's really about 5 people that are trying to lead this charge on them controlling the army. I'm going to have them arrested, and then everybody else will fall in line. So the King of England sends troops to Parliament to arrest members of Parliament. That's a bad look, because they're saying you shouldn't get the army because you're going to use it against us. And to say, no, I'm not, he sends the army to arrest members of Parliament. Well, he kind of just confirmed what they thought was going to happen. Those 5 members are able to escape, and it's really going to start a war between the king and Parliament that becomes known as the English Civil War. And this is really going to upend everything that we know and everything that is known to the English people. It's really going to turn their world upside down, because they've always lived with this idea the king and Parliament are balanced, and what we're going to end up with is king and Parliament at war with each other, and everything's kind of flipped on its head in relation to how England's going to be run. And so in the next lecture, we're going to actually talk about how this kind of more closely works and what ends up happening with the English Civil War and the impact of it afterwards. And that's going to bring us to an end of this section.